I want to go ahead and I want to share a little video from a virtual class that we had. And, as these classes start to occur, we'll be making more and more videos from our live classes and our virtual classes and Zoom classes. But this is a fantastic class. This was the very first class, the inaugural class of the Systemic Flow. And this is the group that came for part 3, live in person at my home and also virtually. We had a total of 30 people attending. And I really liked how it came out. So you can see everyone's on our page. We got some nice groups that got together to study together. And that was really nice. They got to work on each other. They got to work on their family members and clients. And we got some really great content. And as we moved ahead into the lab, we were able to get somebody on the table and then record it. We are assessing the 3 body cavities, and we're demonstrating some very basic assessments, how to go ahead and do an assessment as to how the cavities are expanding and contracting. Super light touch here, one hand behind, one hand on top, and encouraging the patient or client to breathe. And when they take that breath, you can start to make some assessments as to how the body cavity is opening and closing. We move on from there into the abdominal cavity, or the central or middle cavity, which is going to be directly below the diaphragm. We're palpating how that fascia is moving, where the restrictions are within that cavity in general. So we always start out with a little assessment, because that really kind of gets our hands on a client and we get an idea of what type of restrictions that person has. Now from there we move into the lower body cavity and we do the same thing. So we keep it very simple. 3 body cavities in the beginning. In the online portion in part 2, we go over this. I give you a demonstration so that you can practice. And then in part 3, we expand upon it. We learn a little bit more and we practice on each other. So if you're in the live class, you get some hands-on training. If you're virtual, you're observing the hands-on training. And of course, if you're in Zoom, we'll have somebody on the table to do a demonstration with you. And then on the recorded version, these videos will be uploaded into your online class. So your online class will be in a constant stage of development. So what you have in the beginning, as time goes by, we'll be adding videos. So for a year, you'll have these updates. Added to your class. So you will constantly be updated. You'll get an email, hey, your class was updated, check out the new videos. So it'll be an ongoing learning process. On top of that, you will be invited to our monthly study groups, where we break down the protocol even more and maybe even expand upon it, such as the thoracic cavity, abdominal, pelvic floor. We may even have some specialists or other therapists come in and have some good discussions. So our study groups so far have been fantastic, and we expand on those study groups with ways to expand systemic flow. So systemic flow is based on, the original base of this class was the lymphatic system, the digestive system, and the supportive organs, understanding that nothing works in isolation, everything works in combination. We know that the digestive system, which encompasses the intestines, the liver, the small intestine, large intestine, gallbladder, spleen, stomach, all of that is very important, but they also work with other organs. And so the class just continues to develop. So you're going to gain something from each class. After this, we break up into our labs. Everyone takes off and does their thing. You can see everybody in the class is participating, and we're able to watch everybody practice. I interact with everyone and talk with them, get some feedback from them. We got some really good video. This down here is our class at my house. We had 10 people in the class. So that was really nice, really small group. When I do it at my home, I take no more than 10. So it's really, really nice. And then as we moved on and everybody was ready to go, here we're taking questions, answering questions during the class. So this was our virtual group. And then we get into some discussions. Again, our group in the live class and our virtual class are asking questions, and we're answering them as we go along. We're moving on with our slides, and then we get into some more lab and I'm going to go ahead and go over this lab. So here we're doing some tissue release over the area of the spleen. And this is a really nice one of the middle chamber and the fascia surrounding the spleen. And so that's where we're getting into that discussion. And you can see my hands aren't moving very much. So when we get into this lab, we get into very specific things that you may feel. Of course, everybody is different. And then everybody can watch the demonstration and then go into the lab on their own. So it's a big class, very, very involved, very hands-on part 3. So the part 3 class, all hands-on. I highly recommend taking it live if you can, if not live, virtual. And then, of course, the next step would be Zoom. Get the information, start practicing, and see if you can get to a live hands-on class in the future. And that's perfectly fine. You can audit a live class in the future if you've taken it recorded or virtual or on Zoom. So this is, again, working on that region, that quadrant. Then everybody goes off and practices it and gets that technique underway. And then we get back to our group and we talk about the organs and how we apply this technique to all of the organs. And then we go into the thoracic region and we get back into how are we going to implement the things that we learned in part 2 into part 3. And this is where we show you how we transition. So in this demonstration, we're going to do the upper thoracic cavity, but I'm reviewing with everybody about the assessment and why it's so important to discuss the cervical musculature and the thoracic musculature. And so everyone has a different skill set, and we don't go into the musculature in this class. We will in a future class. Everyone has their different techniques, but I'm demonstrating some things that you can look on. So generally when I start this protocol on somebody, this is where I start at the head of the table, and I get to know my client where they're at, where their tension is. And in this situation, what we're doing is we're examining the cervical musculature and the thoracic musculature before we move on to releasing that chamber. And in this particular case, it's important, I demonstrate the importance of looking at the cervical musculature, because at the first onset, when you look at her laying on the table, it really doesn't look like she's got much of restriction. She actually has full range of motion of her neck. She doesn't have any pain. But when we start to assess things, when we start to really look at it, everybody in the class kind of makes the assumption that she's got a tight SCM on the right side. Her head is slightly pulled from the midline on the right side, and everyone goes, oh yeah, look at her SCM is jumping out. And that's the problem. And as we're going over and we're talking about it, we're talking about the position of her head, relation to the thorax, and how could we assess that SCM. So when I get in and I start palpating her SCM on either side is really not much different. It's got a lot of pliability. It is not guarded at all. So what they're seeing on the table is the deeper system, the deeper muscular system that is actually causing that distortion of the position of her head. And we end up determining that the problem really is the scalenes, and how we talk about how the scalenes come down and they jump down through the clavicle and attach to that first rib. So when we assess the scalenes, all of a sudden, oh my goodness, this is so tight on her. She doesn't have any pain here. And so this might not be something you would assess otherwise. But as we start to work the scalenes, we start to notice that things are softening up. And this is definitely something that we would integrate into our protocol. If we couldn't integrate it on that day, it's definitely something we might integrate in another session. But in my opinion, if you have this restriction, moving on to the thoracic cavity doesn't make any sense, because as soon as that person gets up, these restrictions are going to continue to impact how the thoracic cavity is impairing lymphatic flow. And we get into, even though this is a digestive class, if the thoracic cavity is impaired, guess what? That lymph has nowhere to go. The lymph ultimately makes its way into the thoracic cavity. Okay, so very, very important. So I also noticed here that when I start stretching and putting tension on that system, she starts having some issues with mobility. And so we talk about that, and then from there we move into the thorax. Now, in the thorax, we're going to start with the subclavius. I like to talk about that muscle. Not many people talk about it. And I get into the subclavius on her, and talking about let's assess the subclavius, or at least acknowledge it. So this tiny little muscle can become very restricted, and it can cause a restriction between the first rib and the clavicle, which leads to all sorts of problems functionally, not just the lymphatic system, but the lymphatic system, the vascular system, and the nervous system. So we're already there, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to work on that. And I show a few or demonstrate a couple of techniques that I like to use. And again, everybody has their own techniques. I'm not specifying anything, but I like to share with people what I do and the outcomes that I get when I do it. So I'm doing a little fascial release and subclavius release here in the chest. And then from here, I move on into the musculature system of the chest, upper pecs, pec major, pec minor, what restrictions are we finding in the chest? And maybe we'll spend 10 minutes at the beginning of my session addressing any restrictions that I find. And then we go into the first release, and our first release is going to be from the cervical thoracic release, because this first diaphragm that we're going to work on is right here, which is the upper thoracic diaphragm, or the Simpson's fascia. And so you can see how we progress. We progress from cervical to thoracic into the abdomen. And then once we get through this little lab, we move on to our next protocol, which is going to be including an energetic approach that I take from above the clavicle at the acupuncture point stomach 12, and we move on and we integrate this thought process into utilizing stomach 12 and CV17 as our access points, and we are facilitating energy from the upper chamber into the middle chamber. So this is kind of a little bit of a transition into some acupuncture theory and how we're going to move it into our protocols. And I really love this manual technique, and you will learn that in the class. This is kind of what it looks like. It's a really nice technique. People love it. I get a lot of swallowing. I get a lot of gurgling. I get a lot of provocation of the three body cavities when I do this technique. In this class, I bring out my tuning forks, because if I do find that there's some restrictions, sometimes I'll just grab my tuning forks really quickly and go ahead and treat those points. And then I'll find that I get a much nicer release, okay? A lot of times at this point, my clients will start a little cough, maybe a deep breath. So we integrate a lot of fun things into the class. From here, we're going to move on to our thoracic release, and the thoracic release again is very, very gentle. We work in multiple planes of motion, up, down, side to side, and rotation. And we talk about the restrictions that we find, how we progress to the next phase, the next step, and how we can facilitate opening up the fascia of the thoracic region and that first body chamber. Because if we don't open up that first body chamber, we really aren't going to be able to get flow from the abdominal chamber or even the pelvic chamber. So if all of this is blocked and lymph has nowhere to go, we're in trouble. So this to me is paramount to moving on to the middle chamber. Then we break into our labs, and this is my husband. She's going to be practicing these protocols. Everyone practices the thoracic. And we get to watch everyone doing it at home. And this is just a little window on how things go with our live and virtual group. So I hope you enjoyed that little mini presentation on how our class goes, how our discussion goes in a live class, a little bit more about some of the things that we do, and how profound and comprehensive this course actually is.